Hey there, thanks for joining me. Today we're talking about the Rolex Sea-Dweller reference 16600. I love the Sea-Dweller for quite a few reasons. It's got a great history, it tells some great stories, it's connected with some really incredible things, and it's also a supremely capable and ultimately very useful watch, even today. And that is especially the case with this reference 16600. This is a reference that was produced from the late 80s into the mid-aughts. This watch comes at the tail end of the so-called neo-vintage era that defines that period from 1983 or 84 all the way up to the ceramic bezels that started appearing on these watches in the 2010s. A lot of people love this era of Rolex sport watches, myself included, because of their great dimensions. These are super easy watches to wear on the wrist, and they have a character about them that's kind of been lost in the newer generation of Rolex watches. Now, modern Rolexes are of course just as capable as they've ever been, perhaps even more so, but there's something a little bit different than they have been in the past. And if you like the idea of these watches, but don't care so much for some of the baggage that comes with the modern references, then this is a real sweet spot for you. References produced in the late 90s and early aughts are still perfectly capable, great everyday wearers that you don't have to worry all that much about compared to some of the older references, going back into the 60s and 70s, for instance. These are still watches that you can wear every single day. It's going to feel more or less like a modern watch and of course be just as capable as they always have been. The 16600 is all of those things, and of course it comes with that great Sea-Dweller history. I love the stories that this watch has to tell. And I'm not going to go too deep into that history other than to mention its connection with the original SEALAB and the creation of the helium release valve after one of the first aquanauts, Bob Barth, experienced some explosive decompression within the Submariner that took the crystal off of the watch, as the helium that had accumulated inside of the case had nowhere to go as the pressure began expanding on ascension. So this really began as a very niche watch, and Rolex was known to make very niche watches for people exploring and researching at the very edge of what humans could do at the time. Indeed, the intent of the SEALAB project was to test the effects of saturation diving on the human body over great lengths of time. There's much more to it than that, and I'll leave some links to where you can research more about the history down below. But all those stories and all that history is still present in a reference like this 16600 in a way that the watch like the Submariner just doesn't have, and it makes it all the more interesting to me. It's a very unassuming looking diver. 99 out of 100 people would probably think it's a Submariner on your wrist, and that's just fine. This is a watch that kind of flies under the radar for what it is, and I would classify it as a very unpretentious Rolex, if such a thing could be said. This uses the 31-35 movement, so it does get the date. All Sea-Dweller references have had dates, but none of them until recently have had a Cyclops, including this reference 16600. So it has the practicality of having a date there, but without the somewhat controversial look of Cyclops, which isn't for everybody. This watch measures 40 millimeters in diameter. It's about 14.5 millimeters thick, but a lot of that thickness is held within a deeply protruding kind of undercase of the watch. And on my wrist, it nestles in quite comfortably, so it doesn't really look like some ridiculous thick watch, especially when you consider the depth rating of this watch, which is 4,000 feet, or 1,220 meters. So it's still exceptionally capable, but there's no huge compromises that have been made in the overall structure of the case. It has a thin, drilled lug that blends in just beautifully with the overall design. And with a solid end link here, it really wears like most modern watches do. Now the bracelets on modern Rolex watches are a bit better than this, but this certainly has a charm that's kind of lost. And you can probably hear it in the sound that it makes when it's moving around. It's not quite as formal as more modern references, but this watch is kind of like the ultimate comfort food or a well-worn-in t-shirt and jeans. It has something that just feels right, and it makes you want to put it to use. There are louder watches, more interesting watches, more colorful watches, all that kind of stuff. But this is a great, truly capable, everyday tool watch. So I love the balance that this watch finds between that really interesting, rich history and the unpretentiousness of this neo-vintage era of Rolex sport watches, and how it all comes together in this reference is really representative of everything that I love about Rolex tool watches, and something that I would dearly like to see them go to greater lengths to capture in some of their more modern releases. Now, I mentioned this watch is approachable and even accessible. It's still a Rolex dive watch, so it's not cheap, but these can be had for between $8,000 and $12,000 these days, depending on the kit and condition, which in the world of Rolex divers represents a reasonable value in my mind. Don't let the fact that this is a Sea-Dweller intimidate you. Its thickness is more than manageable here. This is an exceptionally wearable watch, and I would argue one that could fill the role of the single dive watch in your collection, arguably in a better way than the Submariner would. This watch represents exactly what Rolex was so good at for so long. And while it might not be the most exotic thing in the world, it's got more character than almost any other black-dialed steel case dive watch that you'll find around today. And that history isn't exactly something that you can manufacture. This is arguably Rolex's most interesting dive watch from their most compelling period. The current reference to Sea-Dweller, the 126600, has grown to 43 millimeters. Of course, it uses a ceramic bezel, and it does bring the Cyclops into the mix. What sets that watch apart is that it has that red line of text on the bottom, which of course is a nice nod to the original reference 1655. But that's a lot of watch. It's a great experience on the wrist, but far from a casually approachable daily wear tool watch like this reference is. Seeing these two watches side by side illustrates exactly where Rolex was and where they are right now. And now that the Deep Sea occupies its own collection, my hope is that we'll see Rolex maybe start to return to some of the features that made the era and the generation of the 16600 so great. And I mean more than in just dimensions. There's far more polished and shiny surfaces on those modern references that you don't really see on watches with the aluminum bezels in them, and there's something that's been lost in translation as a result. The Sea-Dweller, in particular the 16600 here, is everything that I love about Rolex tool watches. And it's a great, under-the-radar, everyday wear that happens to have a substantial history behind it. But I'd love to know what you think about this reference, and about the Sea-Dweller in general. If you're a fan of the Submariner, have you ever considered the Sea-Dweller? What makes a great everyday dive watch to you? Let me know down in the comments below. I'd love to hear from you. If you're not subscribed, now's a great time to do so. And if you enjoyed this content, a like and a share goes a long way. A quick reminder that the Deep Track is viewer supported. I'll leave a link to our Patreon down below. Thanks so much for tuning in, and until next time, take care.